So today we're going to look at endocrinology, which is the study of hormones. So the endocrine system consists of a series of endocrine glands that secrete hormones. And in addition to the endocrine glands, there are hormone-producing cells in a variety of organs throughout the body, some of which we've already looked at. For example, the stomach secretes gastrin, the small intestine secretes cholecystokinin and secretin, the kidneys release erythropoietin in response to hypoxia. So there are two systems in the body that coordinate or integrate activities between different organs, so they all work well together. And those two systems include the nervous system and the endocrine system. So the nervous system reacts very quickly to a stimulus within a matter of seconds, if not faster, and generates nerve impulses that bring about a response. And the response occurs within milliseconds. In general, the nervous system would be very fast to respond to a stimulus and very, very fast to produce an effect, and the effects produced would be short-lived. The endocrine system, on the other hand, consists of a series of glands and hormone-producing cells that respond to a stimulus by releasing hormones. In general, the response time is slow, and the effects that the hormones bring about however, tend to be long-lived. They can last for minutes, for hours, for days, for weeks. So the endocrine system is generally slow to respond and slow to produce effects, but the effects tend to be long-lived. Hormones are released into the blood, and there's no reason to think they don't go out through every capillary bed and bump into every single cell in the body. But hormones don't generally act on every cell in the body. Instead, they act on what are known as their target cells. And a hormone's target cell is a cell that possesses hormone-specific receptors made of protein that are found either embedded in the plasma membrane or found inside the cell. So hormones only affect cells that have these hormone-specific receptors. Now, a given cell can have receptors to a number of hormones. So for example, let's say we've got a cell with estrogen receptors inside the cell and insulin and growth hormone receptors embedded in the plasma membrane. This is a cell that would respond to insulin, growth hormone, and estrogen because it possesses specific receptors to those hormones. Hormones can be classified according to their structure. So there are three chemical classifications for hormones: peptide, steroid, and monoamines. Peptide hormones, sometimes called protein hormones, consist of chains of amino acids. So this would be glycine, leucine, tyrosine, aspartic acid, etc. Peptide hormones consist of chains of amino acids. Most of the hormones secreted in the body are peptides. This would include all of the pituitary hormones. They're all peptides, like growth hormone and prolactin, oxytocin, ADH. Insulin and glucagon are peptide hormones, as are CCK, secretin, and gastrin. The steroid hormones are hormones that are synthesized from cholesterol, and they would include the sex steroids, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. as well as aldosterone and cortisol from the cortex of the adrenal gland. Monoamines are hormones that are synthesized from a single amino acid. For example, an amino acid called tyrosine is enzymatically modified to epinephrine, and epinephrine is an example of a monoamine. The endocrine system consists of 7 major endocrine glands. So this is a chart that you may want to return to, because it'll show hormones associated with each of these glands, many of which we're going to talk about. So the 7 major endocrine glands include the pituitary gland in the brain, the thyroid gland, and the parathyroid gland, both in your neck, the adrenal gland atop the kidney in the abdominal cavity, the pancreas behind the stomach, and the gonads, the testis and the ovary. So we're going to talk first about the pituitary hormones, but before we do, let's take a look at the structure of the pituitary gland and its relationship to the hypothalamus. So the pituitary gland is bilobed. There's an anterior and a posterior pituitary, and the pituitary gland hangs by a stalk called the infundibulum from the hypothalamic region of the diencephalon of the brain. The anterior pituitary is made up of epithelial cells that secrete peptide hormones like FSH, LH, growth hormone, etc. And the posterior pituitary consists of the axon terminals of neurosecretory cells that originate in the hypothalamus. A neurosecretory cell is a special kind of neuron that secretes hormones into the blood. So we're used to neurons that secrete neurotransmitters at a synapse, but neurosecretory cells are special neurons that secrete hormones into the blood. So in the case of the posterior pituitary, there are cells called neurosecretory cells. They're dendritic zones, where the cell body is found, are in the hypothalamus, and they extend axons down through the infundibulum that terminate at axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. And it's the axon terminals of these neurosecretory cells that release ADH and oxytocin into the blood from the posterior pituitary. So we'll look first at anterior pituitary hormones, and then we'll go to posterior pituitary hormones. So the anterior pituitary consists of epithelial cells that secrete a fairly wide variety of hormones that have a number of different effects throughout the body. We'll start with the gonadotropins, FSH and LH. We've talked about them already in the reproductive system, so let's just review. FSH in males stimulates spermatogenesis to occur in the seminiferous tubules of the testes. In females, FSH stimulates the development of the ovarian follicle at the onset of the pre-ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle. LH in males stimulates the Leydig cells in the testes to secrete testosterone, and LH in females triggers ovulation. Ovulation is the rupture of the ovarian follicle at the midpoint of a menstrual cycle that releases the egg onto the surface of the ovary and converts the ovarian follicle into the corpus luteum. Another anterior pituitary hormone is prolactin. So as the name suggests, prolactin promotes the production of a lactational fluid called breast milk in the lactiferous cells of the breast. And this occurs after childbirth. So there's a suckling reflex that actually triggers the release of both prolactin and, as we'll see, oxytocin as well. So the infant suckling on the nipple stimulates sensory endings of sensory neurons that send sensory impulses that triggers the release of prolactin as well as oxytocin from the pituitary gland. And the prolactin from the anterior pituitary then travels by way of the blood to stimulate lactiferous cells in the glands of the breast to fill up with milk. So prolactin stimulates cells in the breast to make and fill up with milk. Prolactin has an interesting effect in that it is similar to a birth control pill. Prolactin will inhibit the release of FSH and LH, and as a result, a breastfeeding mother with high levels of prolactin doesn't have menstrual cycles, in other words, no periods, for probably up to 6 months, because the effect does wear off over time. And this is referred to as amenorrhea. And amenorrhea, or a lack of periods or menstrual cycles, generally occurs over the first 6 months if a mother is breastfeeding her child. The anterior pituitary secretes more growth hormone than any of the other hormones. And growth hormone has a number of effects on cells throughout the body. To include, growth hormone will stimulate the growth of the hyaline cartilage portion of the epiphyseal or growth plates. And that's extremely important for the elongation of bone during the growth years. In fact, growth hormone is the most important stimulus for bone elongation during the growth years. Another effect of growth hormone is to stimulate the uptake of amino acids into cells, and these amino acids, as they enter cells, are stimulated by growth hormone to couple together and synthesize proteins inside the cells. So growth hormone will stimulate amino acid uptake and protein synthesis, both of which contribute to the growth and maintenance of organs over time. Growth hormone will provide fuel substrates for growth, and it does that by stimulating lipolysis in fat cells. Of course, lipolysis is the breakdown of triglycerides or fat molecules, and the fatty acids that result from this breakdown would leave the fat cells, go into the blood. Fatty acids then are taken up by cells and used by cells during cellular respiration to make ATP. There are a couple of pathologies that I wanted to mention associated with growth hormone, and they include dwarfism, gigantism, and acromegaly. So a pituitary dwarf, or as they're sometimes called, little people, occurs in response to lower than normal levels of growth hormone during the growth years. And this causes the epiphyseal plates to close earlier and be less active. And as a result, these individuals don't elongate bones and end up being very short. So a pituitary dwarf would be an individual as an adult with a height that's less than or equal to 4 foot 10 inches. In fact, the average height of a dwarf is somewhere around 4 feet. A pituitary giant or gigantism is the case where there's too much growth hormone during the growth years, and as a result the extremity bones, upper and lower extremity bones, elongate more so than they would otherwise, and these individuals end up being really, really tall. So pituitary giant female would be 6'6" or taller, and a pituitary giant male would be 7 feet or taller. A third pathology is acromegaly, and this is an excessive secretion of growth hormone, often from a pituitary tumor in an adult. So this would be after the epiphyseal plates have closed, and the bones can't get any longer in the case of acromegaly. But excessive amounts of growth hormone in an adult will cause the bones throughout the body to get thicker and thicker and thicker, and that's a hallmark symptom associated with an acromegalic individual. Well, let's move on and talk about the two hormones from the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So oxytocin, or OXT, is the first of the two peptide hormones that we'll look at from the posterior pituitary, and we're only going to look at its effects in females. So oxytocin has two major effects in females. One of those effects is to stimulate the labor contractions that occur during childbirth. Labor refers to contractions of the smooth muscle that makes up the myometrium, or middle layer of the uterus. And when the smooth muscle of the myometrium contracts forcefully, it pushes the baby at the end of a pregnancy out of the uterus, into the vagina, and from there out of the body. So there's a neural reflex associated with the release of oxytocin at the end of pregnancy. And what happens is that at the end of pregnancy, the amniotic sac around the baby in the uterus ruptures or splits open or breaks. And the amniotic fluid at that time rushes out of the uterus, down the vagina, and out of the body. When this occurs, we say that a woman's water has broken. And this causes the baby's head to drop down into the cervix of the uterus, and that causes the cervix to stretch. The stretching of the cervix stimulates stretch receptors in the wall of the cervix that send sensory impulses to the hypothalamus to trigger the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. And oxytocin then from the posterior pituitary travels by way of the blood to stimulate the myometrial smooth muscle cells to contract and induce labor. The second effect that I wanted to tell you about of oxytocin in females is known as milk letdown. So oxytocin is released in response to a suckling infant, and it will stimulate the lactiferous cells in the breast to release their milk into ducts that open at the nipple into the mouth of a suckling infant. So there's probably 15 to 20 of these openings of ducts per nipple, and the suckling baby, in addition to the milk letdown, helps the flow of milk by creating suction as it suckles. Anyway, the release of milk from these cells into the ducts of the breast is called milk letdown, and it's stimulated by oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. So, I just want to emphasize that there are two hormones involved with breastfeeding: prolactin from the anterior pituitary and oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. Their effects are different, and both are necessary for breastfeeding. So prolactin from the anterior pituitary stimulates cells in the breast to make and fill up with breast milk. So prolactin causes cells in the breast to fill up with milk. Oxytocin, on the other hand, will stimulate these cells in the breast to secrete or release their milk into the ducts so that it will flow into the mouth of a suckling infant. The infant suckling on the nipple of the breast will trigger receptors that send sensory impulses to the brain and stimulate the release of both prolactin and oxytocin. The second hormone from the posterior pituitary is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And as we know, ADH helps to reduce the amount of water that one loses in the urine when dehydrated. Now that doesn't add any water to the body. You can only do that by rehydrating. But ADH, by reducing urine volume, helps to conserve body water until you rehydrate. So the stimulus for the release of ADH is hypertonic plasma that results from dehydration. One way a person can dehydrate is to sweat a lot without fluid replacement. So let's just look at what happens when you sweat a lot and move into a dehydrated state. So this would be a capillary, and there is water in plasma. In fact, plasma is primarily water. And this would be the interstitial fluid outside of the capillaries. And these would be epithelial cells associated with a sweat gland. So when you exercise, the skeletal muscle activity generates heat. And you would overheat, which is not in your best interest. And so we undergo evaporative cooling or sweating to get rid of the excess heat generated during exercise from the body. So what happens when you sweat is that the sweat glands secrete a watery solution called sweat onto the surface of the body, and the liquid water component of sweat then evaporates into the atmosphere as water vapor. And the water vapor removes heat from the body as a result. As one sweats, you have to continue to make this watery solution called sweat. And as a result, water in plasma moves out into the interstitial fluid through these cells to form sweat, and then the sweat is evaporated from the body. So sweating pulls water out of blood plasma and reduces the water volume in literally all fluids compartments of the body. And over time, if you sweat a lot without replacing those fluids by just drinking something, you can go into a state of dehydration. So let's look down here at what happens when you become dehydrated with respect to the concentration of solute, particularly the plasma proteins, in plasma. So let's assume that this is normal plasma, and the concentration is 10 proteins per 100 mils. This is just a made-up example. So what's going to happen is we start to exercise, and we lose a lot of water by sweating without fluid replacement. So we're going to lose water, but we don't lose any of the plasma proteins. And this will cause dehydration that concentrates the plasma proteins in the plasma, so that over time, if you lose water by sweating without fluid replacement, we're going to lose some of that water and not lose any of the proteins. And so the plasma in a dehydrated state, at least in this example, would have 10 proteins in 70 mils of plasma. In other words, this has concentrated the proteins in plasma because we've lost water due to sweating without fluid replacement. So in a dehydrated state, we've increased the solute concentration of plasma. That would increase its osmotic pressure and make plasma more hypertonic. So let's now talk about ADH. ADH is designed to decrease urine volume when you're dehydrated. So as the case with any homeostatic mechanism, we begin with normal. So we'll start with a normal amount of water in the body, and we're going to assume that we sweat a lot or didn't drink for a long period of time, maybe have chronic diarrhea, but we move into a dehydrated state. Dehydration will increase the hypertonicity of plasma, which stimulates osmoceptors associated with sensory neurons in the hypothalamus, and that in turn will stimulate the release of ADH from the posterior pituitary. And ADH, as we know from the kidney lectures, will increase the permeability of the epithelial cells that line the collecting duct to water, and water will osmose out of the collecting ducts into the hypertonic interstitial fluid around the loop of Henle, and from there into the peritubular capillaries. Of course, this is water that's being reabsorbed back into the general circulation, and as a result that would decrease the amount of water dripping into the calyces on its way to becoming urine. Okay, we're going to move on next to the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland secretes two hormones, thyroid hormone and calcitonin. So let's look first at thyroid hormone. And by the way, the thyroid gland is located in the neck. So we'll look at thyroid hormone first, and I'm going to abbreviate that TH. Thyroid hormone, like epinephrine, is a monoamine synthesized from an amino acid called tyrosine. Thyroid hormone is the only chemical in the body that contains iodine in its structure. And thyroid hormone is the only reason why you have to have iodine in your diet. And I would encourage all of you to always buy iodized salt. Can't imagine why you wouldn't, because iodized salt is mostly sodium chloride, that's table salt. But it does contain some sodium iodide and potassium iodide as sources of iodine to make sure that you never have a deficiency and that you always have enough iodine to make thyroid hormone in the cells of the thyroid gland. So thyroid hormone has several effects on the body to include an increase in the basal metabolic rate, and that results in generation of body heat to help maintain our relatively high body temperature of 98.6 Fahrenheit or 37 Celsius. And thyroid hormone will increase lipolysis as well. So we start with a normal basal metabolic rate and assume that for whatever reason the basal metabolic rate drops. Now the basal metabolic rate would be the number of reactions occurring within cells per minute. And we're going to assume that the number of these reactions decreases, or a drop in the basal metabolic rate occurs. This will stimulate the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary, and that in turn stimulates the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland will increase the movement of oxygen into cells. It'll increase the activity of mitochondrial enzymes, and as a result, cellular respiration gets revved up, and the cells responding to thyroid hormone make more ATP. The extra ATP that's synthesized is going to allow ATP-dependent reactions, which are rate limiting, to occur, and as a result, you would see an increase in the number of reactions occurring in the cells, or an increase in the basal metabolic rate back to normal. The reactions of cellular respiration generate body heat as well, and that too is an effect of thyroid hormone. In addition, thyroid hormone stimulates lipolysis in fat cells in order to provide fuel substrate that cells can use to make ATP. There are a couple of pathologies associated with thyroid hormone. They include hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. And we'll look at hypothyroidism first. So hypothyroidism is a condition associated with an underactive thyroid gland, and that results in chronically low levels of thyroid hormone, which would cause the basal metabolic rate to be lower than normal. So there are two types of hypothyroidism. One type of hypothyroidism is called cretinism, and it's also known as congenital hypothyroidism. A congenital pathology is one that is present at birth. So kids are born with this condition known as cretinism. If cretinism goes untreated, then these babies that are hypothyroidic at birth have a very low basal metabolic rate. They're very sluggish. They sleep a lot, and it turns out that they will develop severe intellectual disabilities, because thyroid hormone is essential for the development of the brain across the first 6 months of life. So the treatment for cretinism, which can be detected right at birth, is hormone replacement therapy for life. Another type of hypothyroidism is known as myxedema. And this is an underactive thyroid gland that's not secreting sufficient amounts of thyroid hormone in the adult. And these are individuals that have a low basal metabolic rate. They can be mentally slow. It takes a little while to solve problems, and they always seem to be chronically tired, want to take naps all the time, and because the cells of their body are not cannibalizing fuel substrates, they tend to gain weight. So now we're going to look at hyperthyroidism. This would be an overactive thyroid gland that secretes too much thyroid hormone and leads to elevated basal metabolic rate. So the symptoms of hyperthyroidism would be a higher than normal basal metabolic rate, and because the cells of the body are breaking down fuel substrates, they generally experience weight loss. High levels of cellular respiration will generate a lot of heat, and so these are individuals that tend to sweat a lot. In general, they are hyperactive and often have difficulty sleeping. Difficulty sleeping is known as insomnia. Before we leave the thyroid gland, I was going to mention one other condition known as goiter. So it turns out that the thyroid gland will get bigger or enlarge if one has a diet deficient in iodine. And the enlargement of the thyroid gland can be noticeable swelling in the neck, and it occurs in individuals who aren't getting enough iodine in their diet. So you always want to make sure that you eat an iodized salt or eat foods that contain iodine. And that would include fish, dairy products, and cereal grains. It's pretty hard to have a deficiency of anything in the United States because, if anything, we overeat. We're going to look at two peptide hormones that regulate calcium homeostasis. And these two peptide hormones would be calcitonin from the thyroid gland and PTH from the parathyroid gland. So before we look at these two peptide hormones that regulate calcium homeostasis, I want to talk a little bit about calcium. Now, the term homeostasis means to maintain a relatively constant or stable internal environment. And there are a number of homeostatic mechanisms that assist the body in maintaining their blood pressure and fluid volume and breathing rate, etc. over time. And they would be homeostatic mechanisms. So I just wanted to re-emphasize that word. So calcium is essential, and it's associated with a number of activities within the body. Calcium is absolutely essential for the formation of teeth and bones. You've got calcium salt crystals in the bony matrix, for example. Calcium ions are necessary for muscle contraction. So we talked about calcium as an intracellular trigger for muscle contraction. It's released from the cisterns of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, binds to troponin, shifts tropomyosin off, etc. You don't have to know that, but just wanted to kind of tweak your memory. Calcium ions are cofactors in that they are necessary to activate certain enzymes. So calcium ions bind to certain enzymes in the body, and they have to do that before the enzyme can catalyze a reaction. So calcium ions are necessary to activate certain enzymes in the body. That's an important function of calcium. Calcium is necessary for blood clotting. So this is just a partial list because calcium is necessary for a number of different processes that occur within the body. And as a result, its levels or availability to cells has to be regulated by homeostatic mechanisms involving these two hormones. So before we talk about the function of these hormones, let me mention two bone cells that live on the surface of bone that are involved with calcium homeostasis. And these two bone cells include the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. So osteoblasts are involved with bone deposition. Bone deposition would be the formation of a new bony matrix or a new bone by the osteoblastic cells. Osteoblastic cells make what's known as the osteoid. And the osteoid would be the ground substance and collagen fibers. And once the osteoblasts make the ground substance and the collagen fibers that combine to form the osteoid, calcium ions and phosphate ions move out of the blood and deposit as calcium salt crystals into the osteoid. The osteoid and the calcium salt crystals together make up the bony matrix. So when osteoblastic activity occurs, bone deposition results in the removal of calcium from blood as the calcium forms crystals in the bony matrix. And an increase in osteoblastic activity will result in a decrease in the concentration of calcium ions in blood plasma. The other cells are called osteoclasts, and these cells are involved with the breakdown of the bony matrix, known as bone resorption. So osteoclasts are cells that live on the surface of bone, and they secrete enzymes and acids that break down the bony matrix and solubilize the calcium salt crystals that releases calcium ions from the bony matrix as it breaks down. And those calcium ions then would go into the blood to raise calcium levels in the blood. So any increase in osteoclastic activity will stimulate the breakdown of the bony matrix and the release of calcium ions into the blood. So this is just a simple diagram showing the interplay of the osteoblast and osteoclasts as they help to regulate calcium levels in the blood plasma. So osteoblasts are involved with bone deposition, and osteoblasts form bone, or the bony matrix, on the surface of bones. And as the osteoblasts form new bony matrix on the surface of bones, calcium ions and phosphate ions are pulled out of the blood and form calcium salt crystals. The osteoclasts are involved with bone resorption, so they break down the bony matrix on the surface of bones. And as they do, calcium ions and phosphate ions are released from the bony matrix and go into the blood plasma. So the activity of osteoblast will decrease the amount of calcium in blood plasma as the calcium forms calcium crystals in the bony matrix, and osteoclast will break down the bony matrix to release calcium ions that then can go into blood plasma to increase calcium levels in the blood. So calcitonin is a peptide hormone secreted by the thyroid gland, and it acts to decrease the concentration of calcium ions in the blood when the calcium ion concentration gets too high, and that occurs as you're processing the calcium ions coming in from the small intestine. So we'll start with normal levels of calcium ions in the blood, and we're going to assume that you eat a meal and you're processing the food in the small intestine. Calcium ions are being absorbed from the food and come into the blood, and as a result, the calcium ion concentration in the blood goes up. Increases in the concentration of calcium in the blood will stimulate the release of calcitonin from the thyroid gland, and calcitonin will stimulate osteoblastic cells to form new bony matrix on the surface of bones, and that will decrease the amount of calcium in the blood as the calcium ions move out of the blood into the bony matrix and bring the calcium levels in blood back to normal. Osteoblasts and osteoclasts have antagonistic effects. In other words, effects that oppose one another. They do just the opposite. Osteoblasts decrease calcium in the blood, and osteoclasts increase calcium in the blood. So calcitonin not only stimulates osteoblast in order to bring calcium levels down, but it will inhibit the activity of osteoclasts as well. The parathyroid gland is beside the thyroid gland in the neck. So para means beside, and the parathyroid gland is a gland beside the thyroid gland in the neck. So PTH is parathyroid hormone, and it's the hormone secreted by the parathyroid gland. PTH, like calcitonin, helps to regulate calcium homeostasis. PTH has just the opposite effect of calcitonin. PTH will increase the amount of calcium circulating in the blood between meals when calcium levels start to drop. So we're going to start with a normal amount of calcium in the blood, and then assume that we are between meals and haven't eaten for a while. And as a result, the calcium levels are starting to drop in the blood as calcium ions go into cells. And that will stimulate the release of PTH from the parathyroid gland. PTH from the parathyroid gland will stimulate osteoclasts to break down the bony matrix and release calcium from the bony matrix into the blood to bring calcium levels back to normal. So, PTH will stimulate the surface resorption of the bony matrix to pay out or release calcium to regulate its concentration in blood and hence its availability to the cells of the body. Because osteoblasts antagonize the activity of osteoclasts, PTH will inhibit the activity of osteoblasts as it stimulates the activity of osteoclasts. So if we look at these two hormones, what we find is this would be a graph showing the concentration of calcium ions in the blood over time. So when you eat a meal, calcium ions come in from the food and the calcium concentration of the blood goes up. That will stimulate the release of calcitonin to bring the calcium levels back down as you deposit calcium salt crystals on the surface of bone. That's an osteoblast activity. As the calcium levels drop between meals, that will stimulate the release of PTH, which promotes the activity of osteoclasts. And so you break down the bony matrix on the surface of bone and pay calcium out to bring the calcium levels back up. So this would be the dashed line would be the normal amounts of calcium that we want to maintain over time. And if we deviate away from normal, either too much or too little, we have these hormones along with the activity of bone cells that help to regulate or keep the calcium levels at some kind of stable set point. There's a couple of disorders or pathologies associated with the parathyroid gland that I wanted to share. One is hypoparathyroidism, and the other is hyperparathyroidism. So hypoparathyroidism, hypo means low, hyper means high. Hypoparathyroidism is an underactive parathyroid gland. And these are individuals that have chronically low levels of PTH, and as a result lack a good PTH effect to bring calcium levels up between meals. So these individuals tend to have chronically low levels of calcium ions in the blood. That's a condition known as hypocalcemia. And the symptoms include the twitching of skeletal muscle, they kind of just twitch, and problems contracting their diaphragm. That can actually lead to a tetany of the diaphragm. And that causes breathing problems that can result in suffocation and death. Hyperparathyroidism is an oversecretion of PTH So they have chronically high levels of PTH being secreted all of the time, and that leads to hypercalcemia, or really high levels of calcium ions in the blood at all times, because you're overstimulating the osteoclasts. And the symptoms associated with hyperparathyroidism include a destruction of the bone over time that leads to osteoporosis and the possible of calcium salt crystals forming in the kidney, in other words, kidney stones. So we're going to move on to the adrenal gland. Ad means on top of, and renal means the kidney. So the adrenal gland is a gland that sits on top of each of the kidneys. The adrenal gland, like many solid organs, has two parts, an outer and an inner part. The outer part is known as the cortex of the adrenal gland, and the cells in the cortex of the adrenal gland secrete cortisol and aldosterone. Those are steroid hormones. The medulla, or inner portion of the adrenal gland, secretes epinephrine. So epinephrine is often just referred to as epi. It's also known as adrenaline. Epinephrine is a monoamine derived from the amino acid tyrosine. And epinephrine, as we've already discussed, is released in response to stressors. So there are two types of stressors, psychological and physiological. Psychological stressors that will stimulate the release of epi include fear, anxiety, and guilt. And physiological stressors include exercise, hypoglycemia or low blood sugar levels, some kind of a traumatic injury, surgery would do it, extreme cold. The major and most common type of stress to the body on an everyday basis would be exercise. So we're going to look at some of the effects of epinephrine on the body when it's released in response to stress, like exercise. And all of these effects occur when epi is released, and typically they start to kick in within 15 to 30 seconds of beginning to exercise. So epinephrine has a number of cardiovascular effects. It will increase heart rate, increase stroke volume. When you do that, you increase the cardiac output, or the amount of blood pumped by the heart each minute. Epinephrine will stimulate the contraction of smooth muscle within the walls of arterioles, and their diameter decreases as a result. This is vasoconstriction. And vasoconstriction will increase the peripheral resistance, which in turn increases blood pressure. Epinephrine will decrease the amount of blood flowing to the kidneys and digestive organs and reroute that blood to increase flow to the skeletal muscles of the body. Epinephrine will provide fuel substrates that cells can use to make ATP. It stimulates hepatic glycogenolysis to provide glucose, and lipolysis to provide fatty acids. Epinephrine will increase the diameter of bronchioles by relaxing the smooth muscle around the bronchioles. And as the bronchioles get bigger, it's easier to move larger volumes of air into and out of the lungs, an obvious advantage if you were exercising. So now we'll move to the cortex, or outer portion of the adrenal gland that secretes cortisol and aldosterone, two steroid hormones. Cortisol is also known as hydrocortisone. And cortisol, as we've already seen, helps to regulate blood sugar levels or glucose levels in the blood during a fasting state. So let's begin with normal amounts of glucose in the blood, and just assume that we haven't eaten for, 12 to 24 hours, and we're in a fasting state. Now, glucose is always moving out of the blood into the cells of the body, where it's broken down to CO2 and water in order to make ATP by cellular respiration. So glucose levels in the blood are always dropping, which means you have to add glucose to the blood at the same rate that it is leaving. And we're in what's known as a fasting state. So there's no food being processed in the small intestine, and the small intestine can't serve as a source of glucose. We're assuming in this fasting state that we've run out of liver glycogen, and as a result the liver can't supply glucose to the blood. If there's glycogen in muscle cells, that glycogen, when it's broken down to glucose, that glucose can only be used in the muscle cells, so it can't help to regulate blood sugar levels. And you have to maintain blood sugar levels at all time, even in a fasting state, because brain neurons only use glucose in order to make their ATP by cellular respiration. So glucose is an important fuel substrate for the cells of the body, particularly neurons, and you have to make glucose available to the cells of the body at all times, even if you haven't eaten for many, many hours or days or weeks. So low levels of blood glucose in the blood during a fasting state will stimulate the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and it in turn stimulates the release of cortisol from the cortex of the adrenal gland. Cortisol will increase the breakdown of protein in skeletal muscle and connective tissue, and the proteolysis of protein to amino acids allows these amino acids to move into the blood and be taken up by the liver. Cortisol will stimulate the conversion of these amino acids to glucose, a process known as hepatic gluconeogenesis. So there should be an arrow here pointing up, because cortisol will stimulate that process. And this will form new glucose to maintain blood sugar levels during a fasting state. Another effect of cortisol is to stimulate lipolysis in adipocytes. So cortisol is not only providing glucose as a fuel substrate, but it's also providing fatty acids as a fuel substrate that cells can use to make ATP. Aldosterone, also known as aldo, has a number of effects that we've already talked about. Aldosterone will increase the reabsorption of salt, or sodium chloride, from the distal convoluted tubule. That creates an osmotic gradient that draws water. So aldosterone will increase the reabsorption of water in the distal convoluted tubule. In addition, aldosterone will stimulate potassium ion secretion from blood plasma into the distal convoluted tubule. So the effects of aldosterone include a decrease in salt in urine, or sodium chloride, a decrease in the water found in urine, hence a decrease in urine volume. That's an antidiuretic effect of aldosterone. And aldosterone will increase the potassium ion concentration in urine as it helps the body get rid of excess potassium. The last endocrine gland that we look at is the pancreas. As you know, the pancreas has a dual function. One, the pancreas creates a solution known as the pancreatic juice that helps with digestive activities. The pancreas also is an endocrine gland that secretes hormones. So within the pancreas, there are clusters of cells scattered about a million all total, known as the pancreatic islets. And the pancreatic islets scattered throughout the pancreas contain subpopulations of cells that are referred to with Greek letters. So some of the pancreatic islet cells are known as alpha cells, and they secrete a peptide hormone called glucagon. And other cells associated with the pancreatic islets are known as beta cells, and they secrete insulin. So glucagon and insulin are two hormones, along with cortisol and a few others, that help to regulate blood sugar levels. So let's look at glucagon first. So we'll start with a normal concentration of glucose in the blood, somewhere between 70 to 100 milligrams percent. And we're going to assume that we are between meals in a post-absorptive state, when the glucose levels are starting to drop. And low blood sugar levels will stimulate the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets to release glucagon into the blood. And glucagon will stimulate hepatic glycogenolysis, or the breakdown of glycogen in liver cells to glucose. And then the glucose will leave the liver cells, go into the blood, where it now is available to the cells of the body. And glucagon will do this until you either eat or run out of liver glycogen. Of course, when you run out of liver glycogen, that's when cortisol's effect of gluconeogenesis kicks in to maintain blood sugar levels until you either eat or die. So now we'll look at insulin. And I do want to say that insulin is an anabolic hormone in every sense. So anabolic reactions are reactions that result in the synthesis of large molecules like proteins and glycogen and triglycerides from smaller ones. And insulin will stimulate anabolic processes to occur within cells. So insulin is sometimes referred to as a hormone of plenty, where plenty means plenty of organic nutrients. Insulin is a hormone that's released when you are processing the organic nutrients that are being absorbed from a meal in the small intestine. And these organic nutrients are coming into the blood as you process a meal. So insulin is a hormone that's associated with processing a meal in the small intestine. So we're going to start with normal glucose levels in the blood, and we're going to assume that we eat a meal. The nutrients are being absorbed across the wall of the small intestine and coming into the blood. When you process a meal, you'd expect the glucose levels in the blood to go up. Of course, the amino acids and fatty acid levels are going to go up as well. And high levels of glucose in the blood, as you absorb glucose from the small intestine while you're processing a meal, will stimulate the pancreatic beta cells to release insulin. And insulin will increase the movement of glucose from plasma into cells and stimulate glycogenesis in both the liver and muscle. These two effects will cause glucose levels in the blood to drop to bring the glucose concentration back to normal. Insulin will also stimulate the synthesis of triglycerides in fat cells, or lipogenesis, and insulin as an anabolic hormone will also stimulate amino acid uptake by cells and the synthesis of amino acids into proteins. These are all anabolic effects. We've talked about diabetes mellitus when we took a look at the urinary system, but I wanted to just go over it one more time. So diabetes mellitus means sweet tasting urine. And that's because a individual with diabetes mellitus would have glucose in their urine, and sure enough, apparently, if you taste that urine, it would taste sweet. So diabetes mellitus is a disease caused by a lack of insulin or a decrease in the effectiveness of insulin. There are two types of diabetes mellitus. One type is type 1, and that is the type of diabetes that around 10% of diabetics have. And it's caused by an autoimmune issue where the white blood cells kill off the pancreatic beta cells, and those pancreatic beta cells, as they die, are not replaced. So over time, a person with type 1 diabetes literally cannot make insulin. And as a result, they die without hormone replacement therapy. So a type 1 diabetic always has to get injections of insulin before a meal, usually about 15 or so minutes before a meal. So they have the insulin in their system that can process glucose and other nutrients coming into the body as they process that meal. A type 2 diabetic, which accounts for 9 out of 10 or 90%, the overwhelming majority of diabetics, results from a decrease in the number of insulin receptors on insulin's target cells. And with fewer receptors to bind to have an effect on the target cells, the type 2 diabetic shows a lack of sensitivity or responsiveness to the insulin that's still being secreted by their pancreatic beta cells. So a type 2 diabetic is encouraged to undergo some lifestyle changes to lose weight, exercise more, reduce the carbohydrate content in their diet so they're taking in less sugar. And in some cases, a type 2 diabetic would take drugs and possibly even supplemental insulin. So, a diabetic, whether type 1 or type 2, would experience the same symptoms. These are the symptoms that occur in an untreated diabetic. So in other words, if you treat diabetes, you can manage these symptoms. But let's assume that you're not treating the diabetic, and these are the symptoms that would occur. By the way, these symptoms over time would kill you. So, some of the symptoms in an untreated diabetic include hyperglycemia, which would be high levels of glucose in the blood, glucosuria, or glucose in the urine, polyuria, excessive urination, and because of the excessive urination, diabetics tend to be thirsty and dehydrated. So they drink a lot. Another symptom associated with an untreated diabetic includes diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA. So acidic chemicals called ketoacids will build up or accumulate in the blood of a diabetic, and they can lead to acidosis, where the pH of blood drops below 7.35 at the low point of the normal range. And acidosis, if it's severe enough, will cause you to lose consciousness, slip away into a coma, and die. Diabetics who don't receive treatment have a very high risk of atherosclerosis. And atherosclerosis would be fatty deposits that clog up major arteries and reduce the amount of blood that flows to tissue cells downstream. And that means those cells are deprived of oxygen or nutrients and can suffer as a result. So atherosclerosis to the retina of the eye can result in blindness. Atherosclerosis in the renal arteries can result in kidney failure. Atherosclerosis in the heart can result in heart attacks if they occur in the coronary arteries. Atherosclerosis in the brain can lead to strokes. Atherosclerosis in the lower leg can lead to the amputation of toes, feet, and the lower leg itself. So because of this high risk of atherosclerosis, diabetics, if they're not managing their diabetes properly, can end up with all kinds of problems like blindness, kidney failure, heart attacks, strokes, and amputations of the lower limbs. The last topic, then we'll finish up, is insulin shock. So we're used to thinking about a diabetic with really high, dangerously high levels of blood sugar or blood glucose. So insulin shock is kind of an odd sort of condition because insulin shock is when a diabetic has really low amounts of glucose in their blood, and that's called hypoglycemia. So we kind of got to talk about how that occurs. So if a diabetic takes too much insulin before a meal, then because they've taken too much insulin, the blood sugar levels can drop too low, as insulin promotes the movement of glucose into cells and the synthesis of glycogen. And if a person takes too much insulin, so the blood sugar levels fall too low, a diabetic can become hypoglycemic with lower than normal amounts of glucose in their blood. If the blood glucose levels get too low because of this situation, then a diabetic will feel dizzy, they can feel weak, and they may lose consciousness and faint. So this is referred to as insulin shock. There's a shock to the body as blood sugar levels fall when an individual who's diabetic takes too much insulin. So the treatment is just to eat some sugar. And it's not uncommon for a diabetic to carry around some candy or packets of sugar that you could add to water to make some sugar water to drink. You can get sugar by drinking a Coke or a sweet tea. Anyway, if a diabetic has insulin shock, then they can eat some sugar when they start to feel dizzy, and that'll help to bring the blood sugar levels back to normal.